God bless. I want to give an honor to God who is the head over my life. I am reading from Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. I hope everyone is having a blessed day, okay? The subject is Saul's growing fear of David. Okay, so in verse 1, it's saying, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. So Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. So he loved him like a brother. Okay. 2, from what day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. So Saul kept David with him because, he saw something in David. So he wanted him to stay with him and depart from his family. 3, and Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. So Jonathan saw something in David, that he loved, like he loved himself. 4, Jonathan took off the robe and he was wearing and gave it to David along with his titane and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. So in verse 4, Jonathan trusted David because he took off his robe that he was wearing, and he gave it to David along with his titane and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. So he really trusted David. It's something he saw in David. 5, wherever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officer as well. Okay. So in verse 5, it's saying how Saul sent David, for a mission, and David completed it successful, and Saul gave him a high rank in the army, and this pleased all the troops and Saul's officer as well. So Saul gave David a mission to complete, and David completed it successfully. And this pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. Verse 6, when the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistines, the women came out from all the town of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, and with trembles. So, verse 6 is stating, when the men were returning home after David killed the Philistines, okay? And the women came out, from the town of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, okay? So they were happy that David killed the Philistines. 7, as they danced, they sung, Saul was slain his thousands, and David his 10 of thousands. So David was greater than Saul, okay? Because David slayed over 10,000 and Saul only slayed thousands. 8, Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with 10 of thousands, and he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? Okay, so Saul was getting jealous, okay, of the recognition that David was getting, okay, because David was killing 10 of thousands and Saul was only killing thousands, okay? So David was considered greater than Saul because he got the work done, okay? And people began to see the work that David was doing. And Saul was angry because David was becoming great. 9, and from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. So in verse 9, it's saying how Saul kept a close eye on David, okay? 10. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. So Saul was so jealous of David that the next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing with the lyre as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand. So Saul was so jealous of David that he had an evil spirit come upon him because of the jealousy that he held for David. Because David was more great. Because David was getting recognized. Because David was doing the work. Because David knew how to get the task done. So he had a spear in his hand. Verse 11, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David excluded him twice. So Saul was so enraged with David that he wanted to pin him to the wall. 12. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. See, Saul was more afraid of David because the Lord was with David. And he had departed from Saul. I'm going to say that again. The Lord was with David, but the Lord had departed from Saul. 13. So he sent David away from him and gave him a command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops on their campaign. See, and everything that David did, he completed it. Matter of fact, he made it great. And Saul saw that. He saw how great David was. That's what sparked jealousy. And that's what spoke hate towards David. See, God, the Lord was leading David's steps. That's how come he became to be so great. 14, and everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. And everything David did, everything David touched, it became successful because the Lord was with him. The Lord was leading his steps. And that's how he was so successful. But see, the Lord wasn't with Saul. 15. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. When Saul saw how successful David was, he was afraid of him. Because, see, the Lord was leading David's steps. Okay, the Lord was making David successful. There was no task that David could not complete. There was no task that was going to be hard for David because the Lord was leading his steps. And this is what Saul saw. And this is why Saul was afraid of David, because David was protected by the Lord. David knew that the Lord was with him. Whatever task he had to do, whatever army he had to fight, the Lord was with him. And this is what Saul feared of David. Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. The subject is Saul's growing fear of David. God bless.